I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, and this is the third and final episode in our series explaining National Integrated Planning and Reporting, or what I otherwise call how Australians can rise above politics and set the agenda for the nation's future. In episode 1 of this series, I set out some introductory context for this brand new process of National IP&R. I spoke about its purpose, why it's coming to the fore as an important means of strengthening Australia's democracy at the outset of the 2020s, and how it is already being used to help Australians build their first long-term integrated national community futures plan, Australia Together. In episode 2, I moved on to explain how National IP&R works in practice, how it is a new process that we can add into our existing process of democracy, an easy extra step that fits in with the normal cycle of elections and makes it possible for everyday Australians to take more control of our nation's future, because it gives us a space to organise the future we want together and an agenda for travel towards it. It gives us a space and a method for building a map of the safe paths to our preferred future. I also showed how we can use it to hold governments to account for delivering what is essential for our well-being and security over the long term, not just the short term. And I spoke about some of the opportunities we've missed and some of the wrong, unsafe paths we've taken over the last 30 years because we didn't have National IP&R and we didn't have the sort of long-term integrated plan that it can produce. We didn't have a directional map that we could follow that would take us safely to our preferred destination. Some of those missed opportunities and mistakes are now causing us to waste hundreds of billions of dollars. In particular, we're on the cusp of wasting trillions of dollars and racking up unaffordable bills for our children due to the opportunities we're missing to do something about climate change before it's too late. But these bills are still avoidable if we use National IP&R to its full potential. So, in this last episode in the series, I'll explore the first of many examples of great opportunities that can come from National Integrated Planning and Reporting. Opportunities that don't come from our current arrangements in democracy, because in short, we don't have a planning process that helps us identify them, and we don't have a plan that helps us grab them on time. To be more specific about this, our missed opportunities and mistakes don't just happen because we have no plan, although we don't. They happen because we don't use a particular type of planning, long-term integrated planning. If you've already watched earlier episodes of this series, you'll know that long-term national integrated planning is not like any process we have ever used at the national level. For a start, it's way more efficient than blundering through our existing legislative processes and policy programs, as we do now with piecemeal plans that react to rather than prevent crises. And we can get something from it that we can't get from any sort of planning that we have ever done before, none of which has ever been integrated, almost none of which has started from the point of view of future generations, and all of which deals with solving problems after we've made them, rather than with creating a well-understood and agreed preferred future. ACFP has spent a little over 2 years developing and refining National IP&R. We've worked out how to lift it and lift integrated planning reporting from something that's been used since the 2010s only at the local government area level to something that can now be used efficiently and effectively at the national level. It can be used to plan the future of a whole nation, our whole economy, our holistic natural environment and biodiversity, and our cohesion as a democratic society. And it can be used not just by leaders but by busy Australians, easily, to increase their shares of power in their democracy, their control over their own lives, and their control over their futures. ACFP has also begun applying National IP&R. We've been pilot testing it, as it were, by using it to develop starting drafts of Australia's first National Community Futures Plan, Australia Together. This is a long-term integrated plan for our society, environment, economy and democracy that is specifically designed to increase our chances of arriving safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of wellbeing and security for everyone. No such plan has been devised before for Australians, but National IP&R and the rise of the internet has made it possible for Australians to do it for themselves. We can now have planning for the people, by the people. At ACFP, we have kick-started the process, and in effect, by building starting drafts of Australia Together, we've been testing how well the process may work. And now, with a couple of starting drafts of Australia Together, reasonably well developed on the drawing board, we've been able to open up the process so that Australians can see how it can work and how they can become involved to build stronger and stronger plans through time. Plans which take future generations into account in a way that politics and politicians can't. This is why I've subtitled this series, How Australians Can Rise Above Politics and Set the Agenda for the Nation's Future. When we've applied National IP&R to build the first starting drafts of Australia Together, what we've discovered is that the specific opportunities we need to grab to secure our future all pop up quite readily. It's very efficient at isolating the best strategies. But some of these strategies pop up unexpectedly. Sometimes they emerge from the process as surprises, and you can find yourself saying, gosh, I didn't know we needed to do that. Lucky we figured that one out before it's too late. Had we not been applying National IP&R, we would have missed these opportunities. But because the process makes Australians ask themselves what would be best for the long term, what might our kids need, strategies emerge as obvious when they otherwise would have been missed. In the main, though, strategies that are popping up in the starting drafts of Australia Together are things that we already know are necessary. They're not surprises. They are strategies suggested by many of the clever and thoughtful Australians who work hard to figure out solutions to our problems. They aren't always listened to when they should be. But by building Australia Together, we aim to correct that. In the case of those great strategies, the only thing extra that Australia Together adds is the integration. It puts the best strategies together, strategies which from the point of view of the long term are vital, but which don't necessarily get off the starting block in a world confined to choices made through politics. In doing so, National IP&R and Australia Together create a powerful, compelling agenda, one that is greater than the sum of its parts. By integrating these clever strategies, it speeds us towards our preferred future at the lowest long-run cost. This integrated agenda emerges from the vision and directions of the plan. It emerges directly from the aspirations of Australians. When you put them front and centre, it is immediately obvious which strategies fit with the vision and run along the safe paths, and which strategies don't. Instead of selecting strategies based on ideology, National IP&R and the structure of Australia Together itself enable us to select them based on a sense of what will deliver well-being and security for the future, for both us and our children. It's a great quarrel solver, and one which lifts us above having to accept short-term gains at the expense of long-term security. In using it, we can build the most powerful agenda, one that can give us much more confidence in the future because we know the strategies have been specifically selected precisely because they are running along the lines of the safe paths to a well-defined, highly valued destination in the future. Integrated planning and reporting produces a map, but it's a map through time, not a spatial map. And by using it, we can give ourselves the benefit of advance notice that we otherwise would not get, and we can increase the speed with which we can travel to that destination. We can also reduce the cost of travel. We need that speed and cost reduction now more than ever if we're to cap global heating in the next decade before the world emits so much carbon that we can no longer stop the heating and the unaffordable and utterly violent destruction it will bring. National IP&R has arrived and it's ready for use just in time. It is a process that can head off much of this destruction by helping us identify and grab the best strategies now for creating a wonderful future. We can get insights from it that we otherwise would not. The strategies that emerge as best through this particular process give us double benefits. They help us fix the mistakes of the past while also making the best of the future. National IP&R can do this because It brings us together in an efficient system for selecting those strategies without the limitations and delays of politics. Everything on our legislative and policy agendas can be selected by us on a completely different basis, the basis of what will benefit us all in the future, rather than what will benefit just a few of us now. It might sound impossible, because surely a plan for a whole nation over a 10 to 30 year term is just too complex and has too many variables that will defy integration. But once we switch over to that futures-based framework, everything does become easier to coordinate. Everything in our organisational capability becomes efficient. And with the time and money that we gain, we can get prepared for the things we can't control, like pandemics and global economic crises. So in this last episode, I'll look at how the integrated planning part of National IP&R works, because that's where we get the efficiencies that we can't get through politics. How does it act so efficiently to help us easily do something that would otherwise be mind-bogglingly complex? I'll also look at a couple of examples about what we get if we take up the opportunity and what we miss if we don't. We're very unlikely to make it safely through to 2050 by stumbling and faltering as we do now with politics and a legislative agenda that is ad hoc, reactive, often captured by vested and sectional interests, and quite often fails to listen to those with the best ideas. With National IP&R, we can get the insights we need now to be able to reshape our institutions and the role of Australians in building that best future that we can imagine. So let's have a look at how we can get the efficiencies and opportunities we need from National IP&R. National Integrated Planning and Reporting helps Australians produce a plan to secure the future of our society, environment, economy and democracy. In this process, we can identify hundreds of complementary strategies that will enable us to meet the multiplicity of targets we must meet if we're to make the vision of our preferred future a reality. It's a big, serious plan, the like of which has never been constructed before. But big plans can lose focus. So National IP&R includes an element which enables us to identify the areas where the gap between where we are now and where we want to be is biggest. To put this another way, it allows us to identify where we are weakest, most vulnerable, and least prepared as a nation. Because one of the elements in the process is a national wellbeing index, an element which has allowed us to assemble in one place the facts of our current health and well-being as a nation, we have been able to identify the top 20 weaknesses that we must fix by 2030 or sooner if we're to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. Based on the data assembled in the Wellbeing Index, these top 20 weaknesses are growing inequality, growing poverty, homelessness and hunger, a loss of the fair go for all, growth in racial and religious conflict, Indigenous exclusion and disadvantage, an outmoded and failing constitution, loss of rights, openness and transparency in governance, declining participation in democracy, unethical governance, particularly at the federal level, fractious international relations, corporate irresponsibility, economic decline, lost public ownership, inertia in transition to decarbonisation, environmental decline, climate policy failure, declining health and safety at home, declining educational attainment, declining quality of life and social cohesion, and declining well-being and happiness. This might seem daunting, but in fact, we can fix these things within the decade. And in this episode, I'm going to provide some insights into how Australia Together works to help us do that. I'll go through a small number of examples of the things it contains that can vastly increase our chances of fixing all these weaknesses. To do that, I'm going to open up just a few pages in the plan. This doesn't mean you will need to read a lot of fine print. It's simply looking inside the plan at a few examples of things we need to focus on and integrate if we are to solve these 20 weaknesses. By focusing on these, we can be reasonably certain that we're putting our money where it is needed most and where it will result in the biggest gains. Anything that helps us in one or more of these areas is an opportunity not to be missed in this decade, and it will pay big dividends in future decades. Anything that helps us in one or more of these areas will help us pick up speed and save money. So, for instance, a strategy such as constitutional recognition of First Nations is one that is likely to emerge as something we must fix and fix soon, because it is central to dealing with the serious issue of Indigenous exclusion and disadvantage, which in turn is central to making several aspects of the vision of Australia together a reality. But it is also a very important strategy because if we can achieve it, it can help us fix multiple other priority issues, including growing inequality, growing poverty, homelessness and hunger, our recent loss of the fair go for all, our recent growth in racial and religious conflict, our outmoded and failing constitution, our loss of rights, open governance and transparency, particularly since the early 2000s, and the recent discernible decline in our quality of life and social cohesion. Constitutional recognition of First Nations is a very powerful strategy, helping us fix much more than we might assume at first glance. So, by using the Wellbeing Index to establish the facts of our current wellbeing and security, and thereby isolating these 20 areas of serious weakness, we are establishing a framework for selecting the strategies that help us address the worst parts of our current health as a nation. But the 57 directions embedded in the framework also help us select strategies that will propel us quickly towards the best that we can imagine becoming as a nation. With the aid of both the Wellbeing Index, which looks at how we are now, and the 57 directions, which look at what we want to become, we now have clear starting points and clear destination points in one place. We have the basis of our map. And more than that, we have clear insights into what we need to cure, what we need to prevent, what we can prepare for, and what we can grab as opportunities. Strategies which act as both cures and preventions help us prepare for trouble and are very cost effective. In this process, a strategy such as one to achieve constitutional recognition of First Nations doesn't just emerge as something to address the worst of our present and our past. It emerges as something that takes us safely to the best future. So this is a strategy with a double benefit, and therefore an opportunity not to be missed. We can address the worst and become the best version of ourselves in the one action, and both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians gain. This sort of double benefit decision framework inbuilt in the plan frees us up to go about our daily business and take care of our families as we wish, because it can only increase our confidence that strategies for our future are being selected for their propensity to fix the problems from our past and create the new world we want to share. It's a selection system that we can rely on to help us catch up and get ahead of our problems. Instead of trying to work out which politician has the right solution, we can vastly improve the reliability of the process for extracting the solutions. This will make everyone's lives easier, including the lives of the politicians. With this sort of framework in place for efficient selection of the strategies that are most likely to fit with our long-term aims, we don't need to be concentrating all the time on the full detail or be swamped by the confusing arguments between politicians. We can save ourselves the time we waste in that confusion if we can be confident that our selection mechanism for strategies is a good one, that it can be used efficiently to select what are going to be the fairest and most reliable strategies. If we want to, we can also look into any part of the plan and decide for ourselves that a strategy that happens to be important to us as individuals is the most likely one to bring all of us double benefits. In addition, with this framework, we can build confidence that a strategy that has been selected because it fits with the vision and directions isn't likely to disable another strategy in some other part of the plan. that is important to someone else. The framework integrates all the strategies so everyone is protected. Everyone gets to share in the future. We can go wrong, of course, in selection of strategies, but the chances of going wrong are significantly lower than they would be if we didn't plan in this way. To demonstrate that, we can look at another example of how the strategies that are most likely to be the best and safest can and do emerge efficiently because of this selection framework. In the case, for instance, of taxation policy, we can ask ourselves, in terms of the vision and directions, is a flatter income tax system like the one we legislated in 2019 the best for our future, or should we move back to a more progressive taxation system where the highest income earners bear a larger proportion of the burden of raising revenue for our services from taxation? Does a more regressive taxation system, where the larger proportion of the burden falls on those with the lowest incomes, fit best with our vision and directions? Flatter tax systems have some benefits in some circumstances, but in the case of the more regressive tax system that we legislated in 2019, the one where we deducted over $300 billion from our potential revenues for our services over the years to 2029, the one where we remove funding for the equivalent of a full year's worth of our services in health, welfare and education, and the one where we reduced our total income tax revenues by a system which will actually lower the average tax paid by the top 20% of earners and raise the average tax paid by the bottom 80% of income earners. Straight away, we can see that this particular regressive tax legislation doesn't solve any of our top 20 issues and runs counter to a number of safe directions in the plan. It delivers us all a smaller economy in the future, if only because it pulls public investment out of our economy without incentivising any corresponding offset in private investment. And it deadens demand because 80% of income earners have less spending power, which in turn will increase unemployment. Those at the bottom will receive the smallest shares of that smaller future economy. It amounts to an exorbitant reduction in our security, not just because it results in loss of vital health, welfare and education services, but because it doesn't address growing inequality. It doesn't address growing poverty, homelessness and hunger. It doesn't address the loss of the fair go for all that we have been witnessing of late. It makes all these things worse. That loss of the fair go for all is a killer for our economy, because if Australians aren't treated fairly, they have far fewer incentives to work together, and that ability to work together is a prerequisite for managing economic challenges of the next decade. The tax cuts of 2019 therefore also aggravate our recent economic decline, and they exacerbate the decline we are experiencing in aspects of our physical and mental health, our safety in the home, our educational attainment, our quality of life and social cohesion, and our overall and individual well-being and happiness. A progressive income tax or fairer wealth sharing system, on the other hand, clearly helps us address each of these and more. And it drives us towards our vision via the safe directions, whereas the regressive taxation system that withdraws our own investment in our economy runs contrary to these directions and contrary to quite a few others. To make sense of a flatter, regressive taxation system and such massive reductions in total tax revenues, we would have to forego several aspects of the vision of Australia Together, including the central social aim that everyone can realise their full potential in life as individuals, members of a family and citizens through unlimited opportunities in education and employment of choice. We would also have to give up the aspiration that in 2050 we will be able to act together as a compassionate society, that we will live in a society where equality is valued as enriching human community, cultural harmony and social progress. We would have to give up any hope of living in a country where vital services are fully accessible, where national wealth is fairly shared, and where our economy is sustainable and supports rewarding opportunities and continuous improvement in living standards for everyone. A move to this sort of regressive taxation and substantially smaller participation in our own economy by massive cuts in the total taxation that we pool as our revenue will mean a loss of this future. Indeed, it will mean that we will entrench the reverse of this vision. Almost no one will reach their potential. Compassion will be impossible because the funds aren't there. Inequality will grow. Services will be accessible only by those who can pay the much higher prices for their health, education and aged care. And finally, national wealth will be raised unfairly and will not be shared by the many because the economy itself will be unsustainable. And there are a whole range of things we might want to become as a nation that we will not become, including we will not be a place of optimal health and well-being. We will not be a model of educational opportunity. We won't be a land without homelessness and decent affordable housing for all. We won't be supportive of familial and other connections and without domestic abuse. We won't be a land without child disadvantage. In fact, child disadvantage will increase. We certainly won't be a sure provider of lifelong dignity to the aged and the disabled. And we won't be a society prepared and resilient in times of disaster. These are all directional signposts in Australia Together that we won't be able to follow, however much we may want to. There's also a number of other directions for our environment, economy and democracy that likewise will not be met at all if we persist in attempting to fund our future by means of these regressive tax systems and smaller financial commitments to our own lifestyle and basic welfare. Of course, success in making the vision and directions of Australia Together a reality will depend on much more than how we raise our taxes. But one of the beauties of National IP&R consists in the fact that it can help us find the opportunities we need to take that will in fact reduce the tax burden safely and spread national wealth out for everyone to share so that it multiplies. National IP&R and Australia Together make it possible for us to assemble our strategies so that every dollar of our tax and every hour of our labour that we contribute and every dollar that the private sector contributes in capital multiplies through the economy, but without excessive consumption of non-renewable resources and without essential service loss. Many of these opportunities are already emerging in the starting drafts of Australia Together as top priority targets and strategies for the speed we need to reach targets on time. Some of these are surprising or at least quite new. Most have been proposed before but are yet to be taken up by any government, and some are being implemented already but not to the degree or with the speed we need. A good example of a strategy that isn't new but is yet to be taken up is a legislated program to increase GDP and returns to rural landholders and mitigate climate change at the same time by increasing native forestry cover on land not suitable for higher yield agriculture and by restoring degraded ecosystems. That strategy hunts as a pack with another strategy in another part of the plan for creating a carbon credits market by establishing a government-owned Carbon in the Land and Sea Finance and Trading Corporation. That's one of the institutional changes needed to support our transition to becoming a renewable energy superpower and carbon neutral by 2033. It's a strategy to help recover the financial losses we have built up over the last 2 decades by doing next to nothing about climate change. It does so by helping farmers build up carbon credits that they can sell in domestic and international markets for very good returns if we get into that market by using other strategies in the plan. Australia Together already contains dozens of similarly essential, complementary, strategic innovations, and it is methodically putting these together with strategies for reform of our social support systems, the custodianship of our natural environment and biodiversity, and the revival of our slightly tattered democracy. These days, Australia's democracy is attracting attention for apparent growth in corruption and removal of human rights, particularly to free speech.
So, strategies to address these growing weaknesses are being called for by many Australians, but we struggle to get them on the agenda. They include quite straightforward and long overdue strategies such as a binding code of conduct for federal parliamentarians and a federal independent commission against corruption, or strategies to fund recommendations of royal commissions such as those into Aboriginal deaths in custody and on aged care. Australia has a lamentable record of ignoring Royal Commission recommendations, sometimes for decades. With Australia Together, we can improve our capacity to make sure that the millions we spend on Royal Commissions actually translates to benefit, and that the recommendations don't get shelved, forgotten, or rejected by governments when they shouldn't be. Australia Together is particularly adept at pulling forward the sort of strategies we need if we are to do things like cap global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution temperatures. This is something that we know we need to achieve not by 2050, but within the next 10 to 12 years. Australia Together helps us gear up for that by getting these crucial and urgent institutional changes onto the agenda. For instance, if we wish to transition our economy from carbon dependence to a diversified and more sustainable structure, one ready for the 21st century, and if we wish to do it with fairness and the minimum of hardship, then one vital institutional initiative is to establish our first National Economic Transitions Commission. This is something we don't have now, and without it, or something like it, we are deluding ourselves that we can safely and efficiently make the shift to a new structure for our economy. The strategy of creating a National Economic Transitions Commission acknowledges that globalisation of economies and other global forces such as climate change or pandemics or trade wars will, from time to time, deliver sector-wide shocks to Australia's economy. So it is a new institution to identify the necessary shifts in response and then facilitate the shifts into or out of whatever sectors are being affected by the global shift. Its role is to do this by any supportive means that ensure long-term viability for the economy itself and safety for affected Australians. The Commission would have a Charter of Independence with a statutory requirement to protect the national interest first and foremost in its advice and recommendations to parliaments. It would have a quadruple role in facilitating timely identification of impending sector-wide disruptions to our economy, transparent, defensible recommendations on policy for funding and management of required transitions, implementation of approved funding or stimulatory programs supporting the transitions, and coordination of any multi-agency involvement in establishment of new market structures and regulations necessary to ensure the resilience of any new economic transformations. It is extremely risky that Australia does not currently have such an institution. Indeed, had we had it, say, 10 years ago, we would be in an excellent position to meet our climate commitments with much less disruption and difficulty than we now face, and with far less trauma for those needing to transition out of dying fossil fuel industries. We need new independent institutions for this. As it is, we do not have an agency whose role is to steer us safely out of vulnerable industry sectors and into sectors where we have competitive advantage. Instead, we have come more and more to rely on bodies of advice from the business sector, such as the Minerals Council or the National COVID-19 Commission, which was set up stacked with commercial fossil fuel interests who, surprisingly, recommended a gas-led recovery rather than the diversification away from fossil fuels that we know is essential and that will be forced on us by the impending collapse of fossil fuel markets. If we wish to arrive safely in 2050 with a strong economy that is competitive in 21st century markets, then ad hocery in our responses has to stop. In the early 2020s, we need to re-gear our institutions to carry affected fossil fuel workers and any other affected sectors safely across to the new employment sectors and rebuild any other sectors suffering shocks from global events, such as the tertiary education sector. We have some great public servants who could thrive in this sort of role of furthering the national interest, and there is no reason why we shouldn't set them up to help the nation thrive. But we need to give them insight and guidance on what the national interest is. Earlier in this episode, I spoke of how National IP&R can give us insights that we would otherwise miss. Insights about things we need to cure, prevent, prepare for, and grab as opportunities. I also said that surprising strategies can pop up in National IP&R, things we might otherwise not have detected. And I mentioned mistakes that we've made that we may not have if we had had National IP&R. And because leaders and public servants need these insights, it's worth touching briefly here on the potential of National IP&R to help us all refrain from repeating mistakes we've made because we didn't have a long-term plan. One place where we have made the wrong choice more than once is in national competition policy. But we can't easily detect this without National IP&R. So in the case of competition policy, we are repeating the mistake. Most Australians won't be aware of our national competition policy and its origins in the mid-1990s. But its impact on our economic position now has been enormous. And judging from the outcomes of this policy, that impact has unfortunately been net negative. The original policy was meant to prevent anti-competitive conduct by any big business, government or private. It was intended to introduce competitive neutrality principles, restricting government trading enterprises and utilities from gaining business advantages merely by being government-owned. It was meant to prevent mergers and acquisitions that are contrary to the public interest, and it was meant to provide access for business to monopoly infrastructure on fair and equitable terms. But it hasn't been implemented consistent with all those objectives. On the contrary, we have seen a rise in anti-competitive behaviour by the private sector, aided in some cases by poor regulation from government. We have seen a severe weakening of the legitimate involvement of the government sector in the economy. And instead of providing fair access to monopoly infrastructure, we've seen a transfer of national monopolies, some of which were very profitable for taxpayers, to total monopolistic private control. In fact, we have seen an increase of private sector monopolies and duopolies. We've seen exploitation of public resources such as water at rates well beyond their capacity for renewal. We've had privatisation by sales of public assets for far less than they are worth, and we've seen transfers of profits away from the public that created the assets in the first place into offshore corporate ownership from whence little or no tax is paid. These negative consequences haven't just arisen because the policy was badly applied. They were bound to happen because the policy itself was built on a poor understanding of what was in the long-term national interest. Mistakes arose in part because the policy was built on short-sighted assumptions held by vested interests, assumptions that the public sector contributions to the economy are inherently negative or anti-competitive, when in fact the government sector shouldn't have had its participation restricted if we want the economy to grow. And restricting that participation solves nothing about uncompetitive problems in either the government sector or the private sector. In effect, the misconceived and misapplied national competition policy is the single biggest cause of harms wrought on our economy by neoliberalism in Australia. It wasn't meant to work like that, but it smoothed the way for poorly regulated and exploitative capitalism instead of well-regulated, efficient capitalism. And because it wasn't complemented by decent competition law and a fully independent Competition and Consumer Commission, in other words, because regulation was weak, Australia ended up selling off assets and services for far less than they were worth in the long run. It also eventually stopped programs of genuine efficiency in the government sector, and everyone suffered price rises for the things we sold into the hands of private companies that did not support the national interest and worked in very poorly regulated markets. In 2015, the competition policy was reviewed, and with the benefit of 2 decades of experience, the reviewers should have picked up the obvious, that the policy was not being implemented as intended. But the recommendations made set the policy up not just to repeat, but to widen the original mistakes by approving expansion of the sort of public assets and services that should be exposed to privatisation and disregarding the obvious negative impacts of the old policy on consumers. National IP&R helps us check whether there was this sort of mistake at the heart of a vital national policy like this one. And if there was, we can at least attempt to avoid repeating it by developing a new strategy. Australia Together can do this because it relies not just on hindsight, but on foresight, and it relies less on the interests of one sectional group, in this case the private sector, and more on what's in the interest of everyone, in this case the interest of both the public and private sectors. Both sectors are necessary for a strong economy. They both need to be competitive and to support each other, especially now that we are faced with the uphill battle of reversing the recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But competition policy has made Australians underplay the role of one of those sectors, and the result, after 30 years of neoliberalism, is a weak economy, one that will definitely not carry us all to safety by 2050 if we keep running it according to current policies. That grim outcome is not necessary. It's not inevitable. If we use National IP&R to its fullest potential, allowing it to bring forward these sorts of insights, we can reset our policy framework, as we must, if we wish to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security.
I hope these examples of the efficiency of national IP&R and the sorts of opportunities that we can grab will encourage Australians to become involved in this new process. For the vast majority of our foreseeable challenges, we actually know what to do as a nation. But our current arrangements in democracy, at least in the last 20 years, haven't allowed us to get the crucial reforms onto the national agenda soon enough. We're always having to wait too long. This is one reason why ACFP began building starting drafts of Australia Together in early 2020 and released the first starting draft in mid-2021, a draft which reached about 30% completion and contained over 180 targets and strategies aimed squarely at making the vision a reality. The plan will continue to grow, and the idea is that as it grows, Australians should be able to see all that is happening and contribute. But the key to building the strongest plan, of course, is to make sure we get the vision and directions right in the first place. To that end, we need the involvement of Australians. This series on National IP&R has been presented to help Australians understand what they get out of National IP&R and how they can participate and make Australia Together their own. One way they can do that is to respond whenever ACFP puts out surveys and requests for comment. You can find links to surveys in the description below. Over the years, we intend to build up our capacity to provide comment channels. The more of us that become involved, the more everyone stands to gain. And it costs nothing at all to become involved. There is no required trade-off in lifestyle. On the contrary, the returns will just keep growing if we master this new way of relating to each other and to our elected leaders. To support that relationship, ACFP will begin soon producing snapshots from Australia Together. These are just little videos showcasing combinations of strategies that will help us solve the things we must solve by 2030 to arrive safely in 2050. There's some exciting things in there, hopeful things that don't require anything more than that we get together and insist on them. This opportunity to insist on these things, to plan together and get great strategies onto the agenda is new because of the rise of the internet. But we shouldn't delay in taking up the opportunity because even as it has just opened up for the first time in democracy, it may be closing. Rights to free speech for Australians have been slowly cut down in more than 100 pieces of legislation over the past 20 years, and no attempts are being made to protect what's left of those freedoms. So while we still have them, we should use them. If we want the legislators to take us seriously, if we want them to hear us at all, then it would be wise not to move past the point where we have no rights left to speak. We've just been given free access to the ultimate platform of equal free speech, the internet. But as yet we're not using it well. And it is time to get smart on the internet by speaking with one voice about what we want for the future. There will be no other opportunity for us to overcome the near overwhelming loss of rights that we are experiencing through the rise of multinational corporations and the military-industrial complex and their creeping control of elected governments. Those private and unaccountable organisations have now grown so large and influential that it's not an overstatement to say that they run our governments, not us. They've grown so massive that more than 50 of the largest 100 economies in the world are corporations. And foreign-owned military weapons corporations now fund and dominate the development of Australia's defence and foreign policy. They're actively setting it on a footing of increased fractiousness in international relations, something that will destroy our peace and security, not secure it. We are moving closer to loss of sovereignty on national security decisions. In the early 2020s, we're being told that it is China that is disregarding our sovereignty, but the reality is that it is we ceding sovereignty to unaccountable corporations. So, at the same time as we've been given the means of more free speech in our democracy via the rise of the internet, we're closer than we've ever been to total loss of control, which means we're closer to becoming an autocracy, closer than we think, and almost too close for comfort. This might not seem evident in our everyday lives, but we do have leaders beating the drums of war and moving strongly away from cooperation in international forums, moving away from efforts to ensure lasting peace via sound diplomacy and partnerships. For the sake of our children and for our own health, it would be a relief to turn away from that outcome before we reach the point of no return and to track back towards democracy. If Australians need any more reasons as to why National IP&R is an opportunity not to be missed, and one that is not on offer elsewhere in so efficient or democratic a form, I'd suggest they take a brief look at the vision and directions for Australia Together. This is a draft vision and might not yet express exactly what we all want, but it would be a healthy exercise to think about the vision in reverse. If you do that, you'll find yourself describing an impoverished, Orwellian dystopia, a world of inequality, a world of environmental disaster, a world in which we are unable to define ourselves with decency and where no other nation thinks we are decent, a world where we don't know who will be excluded next, a world without equal rights, a world of corruption, a police state, a world without freedom of speech, a world of debilitating health problems, a world of lost dreams, a world where none of us is safe. My book, By 2050, contains some more descriptions of that world. That world is probably the world we will wake up in if we miss the opportunity to take National IP&R into our democracy like the totally logical and cooperative and timely thing that it is. ACFP has made it as easy and efficient as we can, so the next step is simply to use it. We won't get another chance to claim back some power before we and our politicians arrive in some other dystopic state, defenceless against unethical, unaccountable corporations. Our prospects are good with National IP&R. To find out more about it and become involved, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au and register for updates.
Thanks for watching this episode. If you like this program, please click like on the YouTube page and share the program with your friends and subscribe to this channel.